Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 31 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to jump into some fantasy football award predictions. So just like the NFL does their award show at the end of the season, we're going to be predicting those, but putting a spin on it. So instead of your traditional actual NFL awards, we're going to be discussing them in terms of fantasy football, so fantasy awards. So we have our fantasy MVP, our fantasy breakout player of the year, fantasy comeback player of the year, our fantasy rookie of the year, and our fantasy football bust of the year. Now, before we jump into that, as always, if you have missed any of our previous shows, you can find them on any platform that carries podcasts. So go give us a follow on your podcast platform of choice. That way you don't miss any future episodes. And go give us a follow on Twitter. We're at Dynasty War Room. We also have a Facebook page. You can go like that and subscribe on YouTube as well at Dynasty War Room. We appreciate all your support. And with all that being said, let's jump on into today's show. So I'm going to start off with a big one. So we're going to start with the MVP. We'll finish with our bust because I do think that my bust of the year take is going to be a little bit more controversial than some of these other picks. Might anger some, but I got to tell you what I think. And with all that being said, we're going to begin with MVP with a player that I have always been a huge fan of, and I think he's been consistently great for fantasy football, but I think he has the potential to get even better in 2024, which is why I think Amon-Ra St. Brown will be the fantasy MVP of the 2024 football season. And St. Brown right now is being drafted as the wide receiver 5 on Sleeper. He's now being valued as the wide receiver 3, just above Jamar Chase on Keep Trade Cut in terms of dynasty rankings. But to me, wide receiver 5 in redraft still is not high enough. I think that he should, at a minimum, be wide receiver 3. I think he is absolutely one of the very few players that can finish at the number 1 spot at the end of the year in terms of wide receiver fantasy scoring. And let me tell you why. So last season, Amon-Ra St. Brown was the wide receiver 3. He could have easily qualified for this award for last season because he had a great season. He finished with 119 catches for 1,515 yards, 10 touchdowns, and he did all of that in 16 games. So we missed an early season game against Carolina. And what's even crazier is that he played through a good chunk of the season with a torn oblique. Not something minor, not, it was a low sprain of something or, whatever the issue might be. He played through an actual torn oblique. We found that out on the Netflix receiver show, and he ended up missing one game because of it, but he continued to play through this, and he still put up monster numbers, and that was with breakout seasons from Sam Laporta, who was the tight end 1, with Jahmyr Gibbs breaking out at some point during the season. Of course, he had a bit of a slow first few weeks, but Jahmyr Gibbs was a great fantasy football running back. David Montgomery was great for fantasy. Josh Reynolds even had some weeks. And then later on in the season, we had some moments from Jameson Williams, all coupled with very good quarterback play from Jared Goff. Now, here in 2024, Josh Reynolds is gone. Jameson Williams is being expected to jump into that wide receiver 2 role. Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta have dealt with hamstring injuries throughout the preseason, both of which have a very high risk of re-injury, which is why I'm a little bit worried about both in terms of redraft. Not in Dynasty. Dynasty, I think they're, perfectly fine where they're currently being valued, which is very high. But for redraft, I am a little bit skeptical that everyone's going to be able to stay healthy. And so, given all of this, I think that all of this is going to point to St. Brown getting north of 175 targets. I mean, he could lead the league in targets, and that's not a huge number more than what he had last season. He was in the low 160s last year, but I think that number is going to be higher. I expect him to play a full season, and if he was able to put up those types of numbers while dealing with a torn oblique, I cannot imagine what he is capable of doing while fully healthy. Jared Goff has a new contract extension, so he's going to be there long term. They have great chemistry. They're clearly, on the same page, wide receiver 1. So Amon-Ra St. Brown is someone that I think belongs in the same conversation as CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill in 2024, and it won't surprise me one bit if he finishes as the overall number one. And for those reasons, he is my fantasy MVP for the 2024 season, especially given the fact you don't have to spend a top 5 pick to get him in your first round. This is somebody that I've seen go kind of all over the place, but most commonly it seems sort of mid to late first round, kind of in those 6 to 8 type of range, depending on your league format and everything. Now, if you're in a half point PPR league, maybe things would change a little bit here. I'm evaluating this in terms of full PPR scoring because Amon-Ra does catch a lot of balls. So take that into account. I don't know that I would necessarily make the same choice in a half point league, but either way, he still should be fantastic and is my fantasy MVP. Now, before we move on to breakout player of the year, I just want to mention, because I'm not doing like an offensive player of the year, just a couple players that I think would potentially qualify for something like that in terms of fantasy scoring, where, still very, very good, outperforms draft position, but maybe not quite enough to be considered, an MVP. Just two other players, Saquon Barkley, Kyler Murray, running back, quarterback, respectively, I think represent really strong values in drafts. Kyler Murray could easily finish as the QB1. He's being drafted pretty late off the board. He's got great weapons. Saquon Barkley in a new offense in Philly with a much better surrounding cast, both in terms of weapons and the offensive line. So just two players that I like a lot, that I've been drafting, and that I think represent values where they're going currently in redraft. Now, breakout players. So if you've been listening to this show at any point or throughout the summer, throughout the offseason, this pick should not surprise you at all. And my breakout player of the year is going to be Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. He is the wide receiver 53 in redraft and wide receiver 50 in Dynasty, which both seem too low for me. To me, the Buffalo Bills offense is still very special, and they lost a lot of talent at receiver. A lot of targets were vacated. So no Stephon Diggs, no Gabe Davis, and they still have Josh Allen, and I expect big things from the offense. And so for me, that means there's going to be a trio of players to go with Allen who I think will all be very, very good for fantasy football. And that is James Cook at running back, Dalton Kincaid at wide receiver, and Khalil Shakir at wide receiver, who I view as the team's number one wideout. Now, he's got some competition, Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel. However, Shakir is, to me, he's the player that represents someone that has the most chemistry with Josh Allen. We saw that in the latter stretch of last season where he was arguably better than Stephon Diggs, more reliable than Stephon Diggs. And, Curtis Samuel coming in as free agent, Keon Coleman, the early draft pick, he's had kind of an up and down camp. Sounds like there have been some reports about him struggling with separation, which was, of course, the huge concern with him coming into the NFL as a prospect. So that's a little bit concerning. And Mac Hollins has been getting some playing time with Curtis Samuel a bit banged up. Now, I do expect Samuel to be healthy, and whether or not it's for week 1 or week 2, I don't think it's going to affect things in a huge way. But I do think it's going to be quite a bit of time until Keon Coleman fully establishes himself as a starter, if it happens at all this year. So because of that, and the fact that Samuel is a bit banged up, I think we've kind of seen what Curtis Samuel is, and he should be good. I mean, we're talking about, he also should be a value. I think that both Samuel and Shakir are going too late in drafts, and I think Keon Coleman is going too early. But Khalil Shakir is someone that he's been good in the preseason. He was good at the end of last year. He's been in redraft leagues. He is being drafted behind Curtis Samuel and Keon Coleman. He's being drafted behind Jameson Williams, Romeo Doubs, Cortland Sutton. I mean, these are all players that I would rather have Khalil Shakir over all of them. And I think he presents higher upside. And as you can tell from those names, this is not a risky pick. There is almost zero risk to drafting Khalil Shakir because of how late he is going. This is not a situation where you have to give up, an elite starting running back or wide receiver or anything that, this is not a top 5, 6, 7 round player that you have to, give up something to draft. It's a very low risk, very high upside. And even if he ends up as the wide receiver 3 on the Bills, which is possible, right? There's certainly a chance that I am wrong about Khalil Shakir. However, even if I am, and he is the wide receiver 3, and he's behind Curtis Samuel, he's behind Keon Coleman, Dalton Kincaid just dominates targets, whatever the situation, you haven't really lost out on anything because these players being drafted in this range are not players that you are necessarily counting on to be starters in your lineup. This is a, first, second, third player on your bench that you are hoping can break out and be someone that you can turn into a starter in your lineup. So given that situation, I'm all aboard taking Khalil Shakir. I've taken him almost as many opportunities as I can so far this month. And I think that last year, so here's just a fun stat for you. So last season through week 6, Khalil Shakir only had 4 catches. He finished the season with 39 for 611 yards. I think that he can break 1,000 yards in 2024. I think that he will catapult himself up into, the wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 in terms of fantasy scoring mix. And I think that's going to be just a huge value, and that's why he is my breakout player of the year. All right. Now, comeback player of the year. So, comeback player of the year for fantasy, the way that I looked at this was, a player that was very disappointing last year that I think will come back and be significantly better for fantasy football. Now, the way this works in the NFL is that typically is a player that was injured and then comes back and stays healthy and has a good year. I'm not looking at it that way. It would be easy for me to, cherry pick one of the quarterbacks that got hurt, or something along those lines. But I'm going to go with a player that, played the majority of the year and was a pretty big disappointment, especially coming off of his 2022 season, who I now think will be great in 2024. So for my comeback player of the year in 2024, I'm going to go with Josh Jacobs, running back of the Green Bay Packers. He is being drafted in redraft as the running back 11. In Dynasty, he's being valued as the running back 14. And I think that the redraft community is getting this right. I think that him being drafted as a top 12 running back is exactly where he should be going. I would almost even have him a spot or 2 higher. I think the news has only gotten better for him in the month of August. And Josh Jacobs was incredible in 2022. He was the running back 3 overall, and everybody was so hyped up for him last season, and then it was just a huge disappointment. He was running back 28. He didn't play a full season. I think he missed about 4 games. He only averaged 3.45 yards per carry, which is a giant red flag. But now he's on a great offense. He's got just a great group of receivers, a great quarterback in Jordan Love, which is a just entirely different scenario than what he was in Vegas. So on top of all this, there's been injuries to his backfield mates. So A.J. Dillon, who is expected to be the number 2, is now out for the season, which means that Marshawn Lloyd, who was rumored to be going on IR for some time, he was not placed on IR. So that's important to note that if you are looking for a handcuff for Jacobs, or, kind of a deep sleeper. I think in Dynasty, people will definitely know who Marshawn Lloyd is at this point, but he didn't go on IR. So he's been a bit banged up though. So I think it's going to be a bit of a slow start to the season for Lloyd, which should mean a ton of carries for Josh Jacobs. And I think he's going to take advantage of this opportunity. I think he's going to be an RB1, be a top 12 running back this season. And that where he's going is good value, and I think we're going to really see Josh Jacobs turn things around from where things were, or at least compared to where things were last season, where things were really tough. Because let's face it, if you had Josh Jacobs on your fantasy team last year, you were keeping him in your starting lineup. He was drafted too high. He was too big of a name. This was not somebody that you could just put on the bench. You're keeping him in your lineup, especially in Dynasty, where you maybe only have 3 startable running backs on your roster in general. So players were kind of stuck with them. They were weighted down. I think that will be different this year, and I expect big things. For my rookie of the year, this one is going to be a little bit, less exciting because I think that Marvin Harrison Jr. is sort of the obvious consensus choice here, and that is who I'm going with. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 8 in redraft. He's being valued as the wide receiver 5 in Dynasty. And here's what I want to say about Marvin Harrison Jr. because it's kind of a mixed bag. He is my choice for rookie of the year simply because I do think that he will be the highest scoring rookie wide receiver. I think that he will be very good in the NFL. I think he's going to have a very good season. However, he will be on very few of my fantasy football teams in redraft because I think he's being drafted too high. Going as the wide receiver 8 leaves very, very little margin for error. I mean, we're talking, Puka Nacua last year had the best rookie season of all time. And he finished as wide receiver 4, which was great. But could you imagine, having drafted a rookie? Rookie wide receivers simply don't finish in the top 5 very often. We've seen it hardly ever. I think, at least from what I can remember, I think it's Jamar Chase and Puka. Jalen Waddle might have been close. I'd have to go back and look, but he had an incredible rookie season as well. But it doesn't happen that often. Typically, rookie wide receivers end up representing very good values in drafts because they're typically drafted. First-round receivers typically go in like the 4th or 5th, 6th round, where if they hit and they turn into wide receiver 1s, then it's a great pick because you drafted them later and everybody's happy. But this kind of takes away some of the upside because he's being drafted to be awesome. He's being drafted to be a top 10 wide receiver, which could happen. It absolutely could happen. I think he's going to be very good. He'll have a 1,000-yard season. He'll be the Cardinals wide receiver 1. But I just want to preface that with, while I do think he's going to be very, very good, I don't know that he is a great value. So it's sort of a double-edged sword here because I do think that he will be my sort of rookie of the year, particularly for dynasty purposes. But if you wanted a rookie that I think will be a better value in drafts, I think that is actually going to be Malik Neighbors, who is going much later. I just took him in an ESPN redraft league in the 5th round, I believe, and I've seen other people land him in the 5th round as well, which I think is really, really good value. Even in the late 4th, mid to late 4th, it's still a good value for Malik Neighbors. And people are very concerned about Daniel Jones. But we're talking about somebody that's being drafted as the wide receiver 23, who I think can finish in that, mid to upper wide receiver 2 range. So I think that he represents a very good value. He will also be awesome for fantasy. I just don't know that he will finish with quite as many fantasy points as Marvin Harrison. But that should just show you how good that these top 2 players are for Dynasty. Now, and for redraft. But keep in mind the quarterbacks here as well. So in terms of real life NFL awards, Rookie of the Year will probably go to a quarterback. So that will likely mean Caleb Williams or Jaden Daniels, who I think both represent pretty solid values in drafts. Neither one of them is going too high. I actually think that Jaden Daniels is somebody that I like a lot in redraft because of how late he's going. And he possesses that rushing upside that we love to see in fantasy. So I expect those 2 guys to have a great season as well. I think that those 4 rookies are probably your safest bets as like just locked in, starters for fantasy. Rome Odunze, I think it's going to take some time for him to catch on with given the receiver room there. Brock Bowers, I think that quarterback situation is going to be a problem for him. And so Jonathan Brooks, the top running back, he's going to miss time to start the season on the PUP list. So, there's going to be some players that maybe there's some delayed gratification that might have, some games at the end of the season that are helpful, but not in terms of overall for the season. And Xavier Worthy, I think, is somebody else that should have a very strong fantasy season. I also think, just going to sneak this in here because I don't know where else to put it, but Rashee Rice is being underdrafted right now because it doesn't look like he's going to get suspended. So here early in the season, if there are still somebody out there that is worried about a suspension, go make a trade offer. You never know what it will take. and the upside is very high for Rice. All right, so moving on now to our final player, final category. There's actually a few players I want to talk about here, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but for my bust of the year, this is a tough category to pick because I think everyone has a different definition of a bust, and for me, the way that I typically view a bust in fantasy football is not necessarily that they just flat out stink and they're unusable entirely for fantasy football. I think that picking a player that is entirely useless is pretty difficult preseason because, number one, most of the time, players that would fall into this category are usually ones that get injured, and predicting injuries is just very difficult to do. And the fantasy community in general is just very good at kind of weeding out players that have, very low floors and don't have high ceilings, and the chances are low that they are useful for fantasy. So in order to truly pick a player that was going to be like useless for fantasy football, you'd have to be getting into the double digit rounds. I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but that players just like completely fall off the face of the earth. So the way that I view this category usually is a player that is not going to be worth the value of where they're being drafted. So the higher the draft pick, the riskier, or not the riskier, but if they don't perform to that standard, the more it's going to hurt you. So for example, if a first round pick performs at a second round pick level, they're still a good player. They're just, they didn't return value on your first round pick, and you really want a first round pick that hits and is awesome. So, and then same being said, if you have a third round player that then produces at a sixth or seventh round pick level, that's obviously going to be disappointing. So things along those lines is what I like to look at. Just players that are not going to be worth where they're being drafted. And to me, there's one big player in the first two rounds, and this is really where I really wanted to look. Okay, when people want to know, okay, who's going to be the bust? They want to know who should I avoid in the first round or the first two rounds of my fantasy football draft. And particularly in the first round, I think there is one player that I am not excited to take that is currently being drafted in the first round. Most leagues he's going off the board at about the 10th overall pick, and or going in that late first range. And for me, that is Garrett Wilson, wide receiver for the New York Jets. So Garrett Wilson has a ton of talent. He's going to be in a situation where the offense he's in should be better. However, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 7. He's being valued in Dynasty as the wide receiver 6. And I just flat out do not think he is worth a first round pick in redraft, let alone in Dynasty, particularly in Superflex leagues. Now, does he have all the talent in the world? Yes. Should he be in a better offensive situation this year than last year because he has Aaron Rodgers instead of Zach Wilson? Yes, of course. But this offense is going to run through Breece Hall. I don't think that Aaron Rodgers is that great of a player. I just don't think he's going to be what he used to. He started to fall off as it was with Green Bay. Wilson was wide receiver 26 last season. So he's never been a top 12 wide receiver. Granted, he's still young. He's only played 2 seasons, but he's never been a top 20 guy, never been a top 15, 10 guy. And last season, he had 168 targets. So he's getting a ton of action on the field, which is great. And that is why people are excited about Garrett Wilson, because the idea is, okay, if these targets are just a little bit better quality than they were last season, he should jump up from wide receiver 26 into the top 15, top 10. But I just don't know that Aaron Rodgers is going to be good enough to justify a wide receiver 7 price tag. Now, I am perfectly fine with Garrett Wilson in the mid-second or the late second. I think that is where he belongs. I think he really belongs more in that sort of late second Devontae Adams type of range in terms of a player that could finish as a wide receiver 1, but I'm not going to draft him at number 10 overall, number 11 overall to be wide receiver 7. So I'm a little bit nervous about this. I think, Puka Nacua is going around later than him, and he was significantly better last season. So now I know that there's a bit of an injury situation there, but Garrett Wilson is just somebody that I'm a bit scared of. And as I mentioned, it doesn't mean I think he's going to suck or be terrible for fantasy. This is just a player that I think is being overdrafted. Price tag is too high for me. Now, I did draft him in a league recently last week. However, I got him at the very back of the second round. So I think that is a much more palatable place to be taking him. Now, if we want to talk about a player or a couple players that I just think will actually be bad, that you will not be able to put into your starting lineup, that fits maybe more with a traditional bust pick, I do have 3 names for you. None of them will surprise you. I think Amari Cooper for the Browns, Keenan Allen from the Bears, both fit into this category. They're being drafted in the same range as Tank Dell, George Pickens, T. Higgins, Christian Kirk, Rashee Rice, Terry McLaurin, all of whom I prefer over those 2 players. I'm just not a believer in Cleveland's offense, and so I think that things are really going to be tough for Amari Cooper. Especially, Jerry Jeudy's there. They got some other players there in offense. It's going to be, I don't believe in Deshaun Watson. And so I think that means his weapons will take a hit. And then Keenan Allen, looked a bit slow here in the preseason. I think that there's a lot of target competition and he's just possesses a lot more risk than some of these other players who I think have some really high upside. So I do prefer some of those other names. And last but not least, I couldn't get through a bust of the year portion without mentioning my guy Stephon Diggs, who is being drafted way too high. I mean, if we're talking a true bust pick in redraft, Stephon Diggs is probably the name that fits the bill most because he's being drafted incredibly high. He's being drafted at wide receiver 16, one spot behind Nico Collins, who I think is being undervalued a little bit. And players that are being drafted behind Stephon Diggs include Cooper Kupp, DJ Moore, Jalen Waddle, Michael Pittman, Malik Neighbors, Zay Flowers. I'd rather have all of those players in redraft and dynasty over Stephon Diggs. So there you have it. That would be my 4 names here that fit into the bust of the year category with Garrett Wilson, Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper, and Keenan Allen. But kind of representing 2 different ways to look at it. I think Garrett Wilson is being overdrafted as a first-round pick, and then Stephon Diggs is somebody that I just think is being drafted way too high. I think, third-round pick in redraft for somebody who's likely not going to be the wide receiver 1 on their own team and might not even be the wide receiver 2. A bit of a tough situation there. I just don't know that I could be talked into that, considering some of the other names that are bona fide number 1s or have been very proven high-level number 2s over the last couple seasons. All right, so there you have it. There is our fantasy award predictions for the 2024 season. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And the schedule will change. So now that we are entering the regular season, we won't have shows every Monday anymore because that would be a bit difficult logistically with games happening all day Sunday and then Monday Night Football. So I'm not sure yet what the schedule will be or if we'll switch to potentially a bi-weekly format, given that this is a dynasty-focused show and not so much focused on redraft. So we'll see what things do. I'll keep people posted on Twitter, but our next episode will likely end up on a Wednesday or Thursday. We'll see how things shake out. But thank you all for tuning in. I appreciate it. And I hope everybody enjoys the week 1 of the 2024 NFL season. And we will talk to you all on the next episode.